Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm your host, Bryan and Jennifer, a partner here at Penta, and I'm joined today by a good friend, Jennifer Rosenthal. Jen is the head of communications at Grayscale Investments, who recently just got some very great news out of the DC Court of Appeals. Just a couple weeks ago, they ruled in favor of Grayscale in their lawsuit against the SEC. This dates back to early October 2021. Grayscale has been working to convert their flagship product, the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, into an exchange-traded fund. And in February 2022, we started working with Jen and the team to make that case. And now that we have at least the first victory of hopefully a line of victories coming forward, thought it'd be a great opportunity to have Jen come on the show. We've had Michael Sonnenschein, the CEO, on the show before. We've had Craig Salm, the chief legal officer. They've talked about their perspectives on this issue and the case they put forward. But I really wanted to get Jen in here to talk more about communications and public affairs and the work that goes maybe sometimes behind the scenes, though it ends up on the front pages, into all of this. So Jen, really excited that you agreed to do this. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Excited to do this. Honored to be number 3 of your Grayscale favorites. So very high up on the top 5 list at a minimum.
Number 3 on the schedule, number 1 in our hearts. But,
don't tell Michael that.
I know he'll listen. Jen, I want to start with your background, because you've got an interesting career path and, took maybe a non-traditional route to where you are today. But we've talked about this a lot. I think it kind of makes you the great communicator you are today too. So back us up to kind of the 101 on Jen's career.
Yeah, thanks. So I started my career, as you mentioned, unconventionally. I went to school to be a high school English teacher, was really impassioned by education equity, and decided to move from teaching high school to pivoting to early literacy and parent engagement through a nonprofit route. And that was my kind of first foray into communications. And then I got recruited to join an education corporation, so a big company, where I was part of a global corporate affairs and marketing team. And that was really interesting because I was part of a comms function, or a corporate affairs function, that not only did comms and PR and social media, but also looked at employee engagement and looked at public affairs and government relations. We were all part of one team and working globally. After that, I had this really interesting moment where I had just I'd finished my master's degree. I had been at Pearson for 5 years, but my experience had always been in education. And I had a couple of mentors who suggested that I go kind of unconventionally mid-career to an agency. And I ended up at what is now FGS Global, crisis communications agency. And I did that, 6 or 8 months before a global pandemic. So it was kind of a confluence of, social, health, economic crises converging. All companies were kind of dealing with some of these challenges at the same time. And I had the experience working in-house at a matrix and, organization. And so, it was just this terrible storm of crisis. But I got amazing experience over the years that I was there. And then I came over to Grayscale, which I would consider more of a kind of an entrepreneurial endeavor. So I joined Grayscale about 2.5 years ago to build our communications and public affairs team strategy and function. And so that's what we've been doing. And we got, as you mentioned, we got really great news this last week.
Yeah, that's excellent. So a lot of our listeners will know, but Grayscale is the largest digital asset manager in the world. When you joined, and you can correct me if my dates are off a little bit, it was sort of an interesting time, I think, in the crypto world, because, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general had been around for a while. It sort of had a pretty niche kind of market in terms of both investors, but also you saw a lot of what I'll call media popping up, but it was a lot of folks starting out on their own or blogging about it. And as is often the case down here in Washington, it hadn't really hit DC's radar, and you didn't see a lot of folks, whether it was regulators or whether it's certainly Congress, paying attention to it. And now you're there for a little bit, but Grayscale's had this goal for a while to convert GBTC into an exchange traded fund. You fast forward to October 2021 to make that applications. Walk me through. I mean, I think you guys knew right away this was going to be something you were really going to have to engage audiences on, and something you were going to have to educate on in a place where there was little education already there.
Yeah. It is interesting because I joined when Bitcoin, I think it had just hit 60,000 and, everyone was really excited about the trajectory of it. And what drew me to the industry was that I believe in new tech, right? I believe in equity. Right? These are things that have resonated with me at a deep level for a long time. And I was really impressed when I learned about blockchain technology, but I also came from, a more traditional background and working at a corporation, working at like a well-established agency. So the idea of running headfirst into like a crypto protocol felt like a little bit of a bridge too far. And the nice thing about Grayscale is that Grayscale is, like you mentioned, the world's largest crypto asset manager, an asset manager first with expertise in crypto, with a specialization in crypto. Right. And that distinction was really what drew me to the company and what drew me to Grayscale's leadership, is this idea that, they've taken crypto and they've put it in a product or a wrapper, US security that is familiar and comfortable to US investors, that has this kind of, this ethos since the company was born, that, we believe in regulations. This business was built and has grown leveraging US rules of financial regulations. And so, as a company, even before I joined, I think the Grayscale team had really focused on how do we take people on this journey. We understand that this is a new asset class. We understand that things are changing and it evolves really quickly. And how do we bring our investors? How do we bring regulators and policymakers? How do we bring people on a journey to help them understand this asset class and the potential that this asset class has? And that was really what drew me from a communications perspective to this role, is the opportunity to tell not only the story of a company, but of an industry. And when, you mentioned the timeline, our flagship fund, Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, right, holds 3.4%. All outstanding Bitcoin, has nearly 1 million investors across all 50 states. And as you mentioned, in 2021 was when the Bitcoin futures ETF started trading. And that was a huge milestone for Bitcoin, right? One that was celebrated. And Grayscale had initially filed to be an ETF. It had always kind of conceived of being an ETF, but it initially had filed to be an ETF in 2017. And then, the SEC at the time was not comfortable with the underlying markets for Bitcoin spot and Bitcoin futures and decided to not approve either of those products. What is lesser known is that behind the scenes, Grayscale actually worked with the SEC for about a year and a half to turn GBTC into the first ever crypto investment vehicle that was voluntarily SEC reporting. And so, when 2021 came around and the Bitcoin futures ETF started trading, we saw that as a great signal that amazing, the regulators are comfortable with the underlying asset class, and we decided to refile to convert GBTC into an ETF. It's called an 18B4 filing. That filing is a 240-day review process. And what's interesting about that review process is that there is this comment letter component to that review process, whereby anyone can submit a comment through this kind of like public governance process to the SEC for consideration as they're deliberating on whether or not to approve or deny what is a rule change. And so, when I remember first looking at the government website, the SEC's website, and there's 3 ways that you can send in a comment letter. And I'm sharing this because it's like this is very common, right? You could either write a letter and print it and physically mail 3 copies. you could go to the website, but there was not a direct URL. You would have to like click around a bunch of times in order to find the form. Or you could send an email, but the email had to have the S number, which is the filing number, in the subject line. And that's like a multi-number like subject line email. So, when we were thinking about and when we engaged you all at Penta, we filed this on behalf of our investors, right? Like this filing is on behalf of our investors and our actions are on behalf of our investors. And we felt like this was a perfect opportunity to give them a platform to have their voices be heard. But we also recognized that it was kind of a cumbersome process to even figure out how to have their voice be heard. So we created a QR code that allowed investors to scan a code and it would populate an email that had the S number right in the subject line, and they could then submit their comment letter. And we, that was kind of our kickoff of our public affairs work. When I say public affairs work, I mean the actual public work, because we had always done a lot of work behind the scenes with policymakers and regulators as that educational partner. But really, we put the our foot on the gas, and we were like, okay, this is an amazing opportunity to allow investors nationwide, nearly 1 million investors across all 50 states, to have their voices heard. And so that's really what we tried to do. Yeah,
and I really want to put a fine point on this. You said something a minute ago too that I don't want to get lost in all of that. I mean, when you think about the different stakeholders that Grayscale has, right, from its employees to its investors to the government regulators, the company had a vision very early on of converting GBTC into an ETF. They were very public and open about that vision. And you also had the recognition that would take education and maturity in the market. And you all set about doing that. So you obviously employees, but your investors understood that vision. You all worked with the SEC and other members of the government kind of well in advance of October 2021, when then you start seeing some things in the crypto market happen, like the futures ETF. You're now not only ready yourself with the product, but you've done your job educating and priming those different stakeholders so they're ready. Gets to what you were just saying a second ago. Now we launch a campaign that we invite folks who feel strongly about this, who want to see that ETF, who want to see, that easier and more consumer protected way to access Bitcoin. You open that up and give them the option to do that. And then you and I know what happens, but we start to see a flood of support for what Grayscale is doing. Yeah, no, it was, all of these things, all of these, communications tactics, strategies, always come with considerations, right? Like, is this the right approach? Because one of the things about Grayscale, which you point out, is that, again, because we're a crypto asset manager, we toe the line between traditional finance and being a regulated and compliant business and being an expert or a specialist in an industry that is absolutely, transformative, that operates in a way that I've never seen any other industry operate. It's fun, it's silly, it's confusing, it's fast moving. There's a totally different language, right? And so, right. As we were thinking about, embarking on this 19B4 journey and throughout the litigation, one of the things that's been really, really important from a communications perspective is tone and our messaging, right? It's how do we maintain a respectful and professional persona, brand dialogue, to show that genuinely we have deep respect for regulators and we understand that they have a really tough job, and that, frankly, the crypto asset class is a small part of their larger, network of responsibilities, but also that there are, millions of people who want access to this asset class, as evidenced by the popularity of a product like GBTC. And so it's always been this, how do we push forward a conversation in a way that's, respectful, but also future looking and forward thinking. I think that's a perfect place to take a quick break. We'll be right back on What's at Stake.
Penta is the world's first comprehensive stakeholder solutions firm. We are a one-stop shop for the intelligence and strategy leaders need to assess a company's reputation and make decisions that improve their positioning. As executives in the C-suite must account for a growing set of engaged stakeholders, all with distinct, fast-changing demands, Penta provides real-time intelligence and strategy solutions. We work with clients solving complex global challenges across a variety of industries. Our clients span technology, financial services, energy, healthcare, and more. To learn more about how Penta can support your company, check out our website at pentagroup.co, our Twitter at pentagrp, or find us on LinkedIn at Penta Group.
We're back on What's at Stake. I'm talking to Jennifer Rosenthal from Grayscale Investments. Jen, you were just talking before the break about the importance of tone and how you communicate, especially on issues like this. That begs the question that you and I have talked about a lot, but I think would be helpful to our listeners of, you do get to a point in this campaign where it looks like the SEC may reject and then ultimately does reject the application from Grayscale. You have strong, legal concerns about their ability to do that given the futures ETF. And Grayscale makes the difficult decision to sue their regulator. Talk about that, as much as you can, I guess, the decision-making process, but more so from a comms perspective, how you balance that, knowing you are going to be around for a while and going to be working with the SEC and the staff there as you have been for years.
Yeah. The decision-making process is, I think, the operative phrase here, because I think what people may not realize is how much work behind the scenes goes into preparation. So, when we are considering any response, and this likely comes from, and you'll appreciate this, Brian, as someone who's in an agency, right? At a strategic communications agency, at a crisis communications agency, one of the things that we kind of work with our clients on very regularly, that was something that, was really important when I joined Grayscale, was this idea of how do we make sure that we're prepared for all scenarios? And that starts with understanding what the possible scenarios are, right? So when we started filing, this 19B4, I'm the person in the room that's asking an annoying amount of questions. Like, what is a 19B4? What does this mean? What is the time clock? How does, what are the different ways in this could all shake out? And I actually think that it's an interesting role of a strategic communications professional, is to be the voice, unapologetically be the voice that's asking the questions that media reporters, that, investors may be asking or thinking about, because you need to ask those questions in order to be able to develop messaging or develop scenario plans for the things that you want to do. So, when we were going through this process, we were ready. We had a full-blown, what we were calling a playbook, for every possible scenario that could have played out. And those were not static documents, right? Those would be constantly evolving. So there would be a development that would happen. Maybe it was a market event in crypto. Maybe it was a new kind of conversation around regulation. Maybe it was, something specific to, Grayscale's business that we needed to just update. So, we were able to, and we were very intentional. So the day the SEC rejected our 19B4 application, because of the playbook that we had, we were able to respond in less than an hour with a press release and, full court press, because we were prepared for that
right
outcome. And it took a lot of preparation to get there, because every single document that we put out has to be, approved by legal and compliance. So I would say, that's probably one of the things I'm most proud of my team for. Is
as you should be. I mean, that's both of those things you just mentioned are super complicated tasks that I think, candidly, a lot of folks don't think about until they're in the moment. But my advice to all my clients is you've got to be prepared for that. That the scenario planning is not a one-time exercise. I mean, you and I were updating things, every time we got a certain comment letter from an influential voice, or we saw something change in the crypto market, and we'll get into, crypto winter and all that, but all of that backdrop impacts how you're communicating, how you're talking to reporters, what other issues they're covering that might start to bleed into yours. And then more importantly, the legal side of this, that everything needs to be perfectly buttoned up. These are not, off the cuff decisions. These are not off the cuff interviews. Like, we're working very closely with a legal team that's making a strong legal case. I often argue, and we had this support on our joint team together. You've got to have a communicator in the room there that understands how to work with lawyers. You got to have a communicator in the room there that understands, especially where the media is coming from and how to talk to the business leaders. And that fulsome effort is what leads to success on any kind of litigation matter.
Yeah, I actually think you're hitting on something that, I use the term strategic communications very intentionally, because I think, historically comms was thought of as like just PR, right? Like, you're a broadcast arm. You are basically, you have a message and you put out a press release and that's your message. Social media, the way in which, we have engagement is what I'll say broadly. I think that's not even an all-encompassing term, but engagement more broadly from brands, from executives, from all different sorts of stakeholders, has really changed the way that you need to do communications. Yeah. And I actually think it's for the better, because, brands are being encouraged to think more holistically about communications across their channels. So how do you think about your owned content, your earned content, your paid content, where you show up? And how do you put forth messages that are resonant? And how do you build your internal team to have the muscle of being able to recalibrate in response to these real-time events? So it's another reason that I think having, and not to Penta's horn, but I think media monitoring is one of the most important parts of any sort of comms function, because how do you, as the communications person at your company, make sure that you're putting your business in the context of what's happening in the world and what's happening, geopolitically? It's imperative as you're thinking about navigating, especially something as sensitive as, litigation.
Yeah, you need that intelligence in the room, and you need the right comms people that understand it, because, we talked about this again in the beginning, but even thinking through, in your case, you've got investors that are eagerly waiting for the ETF, and you've got a regulator on the other side that you'll be working with till, the company's end of time, right? So you've got to balance, like, we can do one communication that's going to make a lot of investors happy, but what does that do for us long term with the regulator? Like, how do you balance those conflicting needs? You need that intelligence, and then, as you call it, that strategic comms in the room to help the executives kind of think through those decisions and make the right play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's always what I call brand tensions, right? It's being a crypto asset manager. So that tension I mentioned around like crypto and TradFi, it's, how do you balance being, respectful or professional or compliant and forward thinking or innovative? These tensions, I think, actually make for really interesting comms and are actually a thought leadership white space, right? So when you think about the opportunity for Grayscale to actually take a leadership position in how do we actually bring people on this journey, help them understand that you're regulating a technology, right? This is a new technology. It's very hard to understand. That's the fact. It's not an easy thing. It would be like asking someone to explain the mechanics of how the internet works, right? Like, this is the next version of the internet. It's really complicated. We haven't even really figured out how to effectively regulate the internet. There's all these conversations about social media companies, right, that have, long gone on. So, it's tricky. And so how do we as a company think about what our space in that conversation is and what our role is, not only for our investors, but for, the other stakeholders that we deem priority.
Yeah. And that raises another good point. You all made the calculation that your your role in this space is obviously not only an advocate of your own products and what you want to bring to consumers, but you've been an industry advocate on that front, and really going back to one of our themes of this show, right? An educator on that front. And so I think a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate too, you enter into the litigation phase, and there's some milestones along the way, which give you media hooks every now and then, but you've got about 9 months until even the hearing. And then you've got another, if I do my math right, 7 or 8 months before a decision. Talk us through about how you all kind of not necessarily kept your foot on the gas, but you kept doing what you were doing. You were true to Grayscale and kind of the education and engagement you had always done. I left out the most important part was during that period, we started entering into a bit of a crypto winter, and you saw things like FTX collapse and a lot of, especially on the political side, start to take a closer look at this industry, try to figure out what was going on. And that was a moment, I think, for education for a lot of these folks, but it came with a moment of scrutiny for the industry as well.
Yeah. So I think one of the, from a communications perspective, I would say one of the things that has always been really refreshing about working with Grayscale is the fact that our North Star has not wavered, right? Our North Star is converting GBTC and our family of products into an ETF, but GBTC to start, right? Bringing Bitcoin even further into the regulatory perimeter. So when you start with that North Star, everything that you do should be in support of that North Star. And, we're talking about a spot Bitcoin ETF. Each of those words to a everyday person means niente, right? It doesn't mean like
Googling.
Yeah. Like the challenge is how do you convince a person who may not know or doesn't who's consuming so much media, who has so many other priorities, who's thinking about so many things when there's so much going on in the world, how do you convince them that even a sliver of their time in their day, their very busy day, is worth thinking about a spot Bitcoin ETF? And, it's an exercise in unpacking the implication in the broader story, right? And so what is the broader story around the spot Bitcoin ETF and why it's important to have this in the United States, right? It's a conversation about, America being a leader in finance and innovation. It's about, it's about investors having choice and access to the products of their choosing. It's about, regulators regulating and creating regulatory frameworks that promote innovation and allow these innovations to flourish, right? So it was, always as we were deliberating on any sort of decision that we were making as a business, it was always with this North Star top of mind. And we made a decision to, despite, the market events that you point to continue to engage, to continue to be that education partner, because, it was that time more than ever before that people needed a trusted voice or a trusted resource that they could turn to on something like crypto. And so, that was always how we thought about it, is that we were unwavering in our North Star of converting GBTC to an ETF.
And you didn't, right? You constantly put out Michael, your CEO, and Craig, your CLO, and you kept accepting those media opportunities, putting them in front of, I would say, both, national media, speaking engagements, but also, I guess you'd call it trade media, but those crypto, specific folks, even in some of the toughest times for crypto to make that case. Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting, right? Because we were, again, in the spirit of preparing for all scenarios. My goal as a communications professional is when I'm working with my executives, I should be the hardest interview that they ever have.
Right.
And in scenarios like this, I wasn't always, right? They were having really tough interviews about like macro conversations that were even above Grayscale's business. And so how do you have that macro conversation, but bring it back to your North Star, which is the importance of, pushing for a spot Bitcoin ETF in the United States. So, yeah, it was a challenge, and we can always, we could talk about how kind of crypto media is very different than traditional media if you want to go that route. But, those are two very different.
Might be another show.
Yeah. Perspective. I feel like that's where you're going. Maybe I can just keep it way up.
No. We'll get you back on for another episode. Break that. Let me, without hitting the fast forward button too hard. So as we mentioned at the top of the show, the litigation goes in your favor, a big win a couple weeks ago, and I'd love to hear kind of how you're thinking about moving forward from here, and some of your don't reveal any secrets for Grayscale, but the communications job never stops. That's not a finish line. You've got a lot of work. I guess we have a lot of work.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you guys are being
right. Yeah.
So where are we? So we got a decision that the court vacated the SEC's denial of GBTC's conversion to an ETF, which was very, very exciting for the Grayscale team and all of our investors. So we're entering into the phase that is we're following the federal rules of appellate procedure. So that is a 45-day window whereby the SEC has the opportunity to review the opinion and decide on their next steps. And so we're in this moment where, it's a bit of a waiting period. And again, if you've made it this far in the conversation, you understand that we're doing a lot of scenario planning, right? So we are thinking through the ways in which this, could potentially shake out. We're continuing to engage with investors, with members of the media to help them understand these, again, spot Bitcoin ETF, federal rules of appellate procedure. They're kind of like wonky terms. So, unpacking, what those terms mean, pointing them to, appropriate documents and guidance. But, it's going to be a fun couple of months, I think. It'll be really interesting to see where, what the SEC decides to do. And we hope that they are thinking about and keeping in mind the million investors that are in GBTC and who really would like to see this product converted into an ETF.
Well, we'll obviously not only be helping, but watching closely.
Quite literally.
Jen, I want one final question, hopefully not too personal, but if you step out of just your role with Grayscale right now and back to that, what we were talking about in the beginning, Jen's career, and just, any lessons learned or, things that have surprised you or you've been most proud of through this process?
It's a good question. So I would say I am incredibly proud. I'm going to answer in multiple ways in like the true like comms list fashion. I'm going to say number one, the number one most thing I am proud of is being part of a small but mighty team. People may not realize, but Grayscale is like 60 people total. So being part of a small but mighty team that has been unwavering and in that North Star to convert GBTC to an ETF and to prioritize investors in all of those efforts. I am really personally proud, number two, of the communications team. We are a team of 4 total, plus our team at Penta, who we consider an extension of our team, and how we've been able to manage not only just the media around this and the messaging and the scenario planning, but we also do owned content, social media, social listening. And so just, the volume of work is pretty unbelievable. So really proud of the team there. And then I guess the third is, it's been really amazing to see how much progress has been made on all fronts. On the regulatory front, we're seeing tons of bipartisan support and interest in crypto. Investors and developers, continue to be excited about the crypto asset class. And as we're heading into the 2024 elections, I am really, really interested to see how kind of crypto, comes and maintains part of that conversation. So I expect innovation will continue, and it's really cool to be a part of a team at Grayscale that is helping not only tell the company's story, but the industry's story. And so
Yeah, really helping to write kind of crypto story. And I personally agree with you, and the listeners have heard this many times, but there's been peaks and valleys, but we've come a long way in 2 years as a crypto industry. And I think the next 2 years will be really fascinating to watch as you see not only the regulatory and kind of policy side come together, but even really start to see some of these products go mainstream and take off. But we'll have you back on to talk about that too, Jen. So
that's great.
But with that, let me just leave it there and thank you so much for coming on. And what went unsaid is how quickly we're doing this after your big legal victory and how busy you are still. So we appreciate you squeezing in some time to record this. And
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the Penta team for their continuous support. We love being partners with you all, and I'm very happy to be able to participate and hope this was helpful for whoever is listening today.
Great. Thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of What's at Stake. We'll be back next week. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis. We'll talk to you then.